Hello and welcome to Marple's Mind, where every story feels like a conversation. Over a warm cup of coffee today, I bring you a brand new Miss Marple mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in. From now, let's get started. Chapter 1. The Peculiar Obituary. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favourite chintz-covered chair by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she perused the morning edition of the St. Mary Mead Gazette. The pale October sunlight filtered through her lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the newspaper pages. She had just finished reading about Mrs. Bantry's successful chrysanthemum display at the village flower show when a small notice in the obituaries column caught her sharp blue eyes. "How very peculiar," she murmured, adjusting her spectacles to read more carefully. The obituary was brief, almost austere in its simplicity. Ashworth, Reginald Percival, passed away peacefully at his residence, Thornfield House, St. Mary Mead, on October 15th. Private arrangements, no flowers, please. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. In all her years in St. Mary Mead, and they were considerable, she had never heard of a Reginald Percival Ashworth. More puzzling still was the mention of Thornfield House. The old Victorian mansion on Elm Grove had stood empty for at least 5 years, ever since old Colonel Bradshaw's distant cousins had failed to agree on its sale. She set down her knitting and reached for the telephone, dialing her friend Dolly Bantry's number with practised ease. "Dolly, dear," she began without preamble when her friend answered. "Have you seen this morning's Gazette? There's a most curious obituary for someone called Reginald Ashworth of Thornfield House." "Thornfield House?" Dolly's voice rose in surprise. "But that's been empty since the Colonel died. Arthur and I walk past it every evening with the dogs, and I've never seen a soul there. The gates are always locked, and the gardens become a perfect wilderness." "Precisely what I thought," Miss Marple agreed. "I wonder if you might ask Arthur. He knows everyone in the village through the Conservative Association." After ending the call, Miss Marple made several more inquiries. She telephoned Miss Weatherby at the post office, who prided herself on knowing every resident's business. She checked with Mr. Hopkins at the grocery, who delivered to every house in the village. She even called upon her nephew Raymond's connection at the local council office. The results were unanimous and deeply troubling. No one had ever heard of Reginald Percival Ashworth. By afternoon, Miss Marple had decided a more direct approach was necessary. She wrapped herself in her warm tweed coat, picked up her sturdy walking stick, and set out for Elm Grove. The walk took her past the familiar sights of St. Mary Mead, the vicarage with its well-tended roses, the Blue Boar pub already showing signs of evening preparation, and Mrs. Hartnell's cottage with its perpetually twitching curtains. Thornfield House stood at the end of Elm Grove, set back from the road behind tall iron gates, now brown with rust. The Victorian Gothic mansion loomed against the grey October sky, its windows dark and empty like hollow eyes. The garden that had once been Colonel Bradshaw's pride was now a tangle of overgrown shrubs and brambles. Miss Marple tested the gates and found them locked, as expected. But as she peered through the bars, something caught her attention. The gravel drive, which should have been thick with weeds after years of neglect, showed signs of recent disturbance. The pattern was subtle, just a slight displacement of stones. But to Miss Marple's experienced eye, it suggested vehicle tracks. "I say, Miss Marple, fancy meeting you here." She turned to find Doctor Haydock approaching, his medical bag in hand. The elderly doctor was one of the few people in St. Mary Mead who matched her in years and local knowledge. "Good afternoon, Doctor," she replied. "I was just curious about this obituary in the Gazette. Did you know a Mr. Ashworth?" Dr. Haydock frowned, pulling out his own folded copy of the newspaper. "Saw it this morning. Peculiar thing. I've been the only doctor in St. Mary Mead for 40 years, and I've never treated anyone by that name. Certainly not at Thornfield House." "The obituary says he died peacefully at his residence," Miss Marple observed. "One would assume that means he died at home, possibly under medical supervision." "Not mine," the doctor said firmly, "and I would have heard if another physician had been attending someone in the village. Professional courtesy, you know." As they stood discussing the mystery, a movement in one of Thornfield House's upper windows caught Miss Marple's eye. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw a curtain twitch, as if someone inside had been watching them and quickly stepped back. "Doctor," she said quietly, "I believe Thornfield House may not be as empty as we thought." Dr. Haydock followed her gaze, but the windows remained dark and still. Impossible! The estate agents would have notified someone if it had been let or sold. But Miss Marple was already making mental notes. A man who never existed had died in a house that was supposed to be empty. Someone had placed that obituary, and someone, she was now certain, was in that house. As she walked home, her mind was working rapidly, connecting invisible threads. In her experience, people didn't create elaborate fictions without reason. And in her considerable experience, such reasons were rarely innocent. The game, as her nephew Raymond might say, was afoot. Chapter 2. The Empty House Mystery. The following morning brought one of those crisp autumn days that made St. Mary Mead look particularly picturesque. Miss Marple was just finishing her breakfast when her nephew Raymond arrived from London, having responded to her carefully worded telephone call the previous evening. "Aunt Jane," he said, kissing her cheek and accepting a cup of tea from her maid Cherry. "Your message was intriguingly vague. Something about needing legal advice regarding an empty property?" Miss Marple smiled innocently. "How nice of you to come. So promptly, dear. I thought perhaps we might take a little walk. The fresh air would do you good after that stuffy train journey." Raymond, well acquainted with his aunt's methods, merely raised an eyebrow and finished his tea. 20 minutes later, they were standing before Thornfield House's imposing gates. "Good heavens!" Raymond exclaimed, taking in the Gothic mansion's deteriorating grandeur. "This is the Bradshaw place, isn't it?" "I remember coming here for a garden party when I was a boy. The Colonel had the most magnificent collection of orchids." "Yes, dear. But I'm more interested in its current occupant." Miss Marple produced the newspaper clipping from her handbag. "Or rather, its recently deceased occupant, who seems never to have existed." As Raymond studied the obituary, Miss Marple noticed something she had missed the day before. The padlock on the gates, while appearing old and rusty from a distance, showed signs of recent use. The keyhole was free of the cobwebs and debris that covered the rest of the ironwork. "This is certainly odd," Raymond agreed. "The Bradshaw estate has been in probate for years. The cousins can't agree on anything. I actually know the solicitor handling it, James Pemberton in London. The house should be completely vacant." "And yet," Miss Marple said, pointing with her walking stick, "observe the ground floor windows on the east side." Raymond looked where she indicated. Unlike the other windows, which were uniformly grey with dust and grime, Two showed slightly cleaner patches, as if someone had wiped small areas to see through. "We could contact Pemberton," Raymond suggested. "Get official permission to investigate." "That would take time," Miss Marple replied. "And I have a feeling time may be rather important. No, I think we should speak to Mrs. Emmet first." Mrs. Emmet lived in the cottage directly opposite Thornfield House's gates. A widow who spent most of her time tending her cats and watching the street, she was better than any security camera. Miss Marple had barely knocked when the door flew open. "Miss Marple! I wondered when you'd come asking about that place." Mrs. Emmet ushered them into her parlour, which smelled strongly of cats and lavender. "Saw you yesterday with Dr. Haydock, peering through those gates. We're interested in any activity you might have noticed at Thornfield House," Miss Marple said, settling into an armchair after carefully removing a sleeping tabby. Mrs. Emmet's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who finally had an audience for her observations. "Funny you should ask. That house is supposed to be empty, but I've seen lights. Not often, mind you, and never for long. Just a glow moving from room to room, like someone with a candle or torch." "When did this start?" Raymond asked, pulling out a notebook. "About 6 months ago, maybe more. Always late at night, past 11, usually. I'm a light sleeper, you see, and Whiskers here likes to sit in the rear window." She indicated a large ginger cat. "I've seen a light maybe once a fortnight, never regular like. What about vehicles?" "Visitors," Miss Marple prompted. "That's the really odd thing." Mrs. Emmet leaned forward conspiratorially. "About once a month, always near midnight, a van comes, no markings on it, just plain dark blue or black, hard to tell in the dark. Parks just inside the gates for maybe 20 minutes, then leaves. Did you ever see who was driving?" "Never got a good look. They always wore a cap pulled low. But here's something peculiar. They had a key to that padlock. Opened it smooth as you please, no fumbling about." Miss Marple exchanged glances with Raymond. Someone had regular access to a house that was supposedly empty and in legal limbo. After thanking Mrs. Emmet and promising to keep her informed, they walked slowly back along Elm Grove. Raymond was already on his mobile phone to Pemberton's office, but as Miss Marple expected, the solicitor was in court and unavailable. "There's another approach we might take," she suggested, as they paused at the corner where Elm Grove met the high street. "The utilities. Even an empty house would have some services maintained. But if someone has been living there—" "Brilliant," Raymond said. "I have a contact at the water board. Let me make some calls." While Raymond pursued his inquiries, Miss Marple decided to visit the village library. The librarian, Miss Harmon, was delighted to help her search through the local directories and electoral rolls. But despite checking records going back 20 years, they found no trace of any Ashworth in St. Mary Mead or the surrounding villages. Although, Miss Harmon said thoughtfully, someone did come in about 3 months ago, asking for old maps of the village. Particularly interested in Elm Grove and the big houses there. Can you describe this person? Middle-aged man, very ordinary looking. Brown hair, medium height, spoke with a slight London accent. He said he was researching local history for a book, but he seemed more interested in property boundaries than historical facts. By evening, Raymond had uncovered something significant. The utility companies confirmed that Thornfield House had active accounts, electricity, water and gas, all being paid regularly by direct debit from a bank account in the name of R.P. Ashworth. The accounts were set up 5 years ago, Raymond reported over dinner at Miss Marple's cottage. Just after Colonel Bradshaw died. Someone has been paying to maintain that house ever since. But who? Miss Marple mused, absently serving the apple Charlotte Cherry had prepared. And why go to such lengths to create a fictional resident? I've been thinking about that, Raymond said. What if Ashworth wasn't meant to be fictional? What if he was meant to be invisible? Someone who existed only on paper, for some specific purpose. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, dear. And now that he's died, someone wants to close that chapter. But why announce it in the newspaper? Why not let him simply fade away? Unless, Raymond said suddenly, someone else placed that obituary. Someone who knew the truth and wanted to force the hand of whoever was behind this charade. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance a dog howled. Miss Marple thought of that dark house on Elm Grove, with its clean patches on dusty windows and its midnight visitors. Whatever secret Thornfield House was hiding, she was certain it was far more sinister than a simple property fraud. I think, she said quietly, we need to discover not just who Reginald Ashworth was, but what he was. Because in my experience, Raymond, people don't create elaborate deceptions without very pressing reasons, and those reasons, I fear, may have led to murder. Chapter 3. The phantom resident Miss Marple spent the next morning in what she privately called her detective mode, a methodical approach that had served her well in previous mysteries. Armed with a shopping basket and her most innocent smile, she set out to trace the paper trail of the mysterious Mr. Reginald Ashworth. Her first stop was the post office, where Miss Weatherby presided over the village's correspondence with the efficiency of a military commander. The small building, with its familiar smell of ink and paper, had been the nerve centre of St. Mary Mead gossip for decades. Miss Weatherby, Miss Marple began, approaching the counter with a parcel to post. I've been wondering about mail delivery to Thornfield House. Do you recall ever sorting letters for a Mr. Ashworth there? Miss Weatherby's sharp features creased in concentration. She prided herself on knowing every address in her domain. Ashworth? No, Miss Marple, definitely not. I've been here 15 years, and I know every name on my routes. Thornfield House gets nothing but circulars and the occasional official notice about the estate. How curious, Miss Marple murmured. Yet he must have received correspondence somewhere. Bank statements, utility bills. Well, Miss Weatherby said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, there is something odd. About 5 years ago, we started getting redirect requests for that address. All mail for R.P. Ashworth was to be forwarded to a post office box in London. I thought it strange at the time. Why have mail sent to an empty house only to redirect it? Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Do you still have the forwarding address? I shouldn't really. Miss Weatherby glanced around the empty post office, then pulled out a worn ledger. Box 247, Kensington Post Office. The redirect order is renewed annually, always paid in cash. After thanking Miss Weatherby, Miss Marple made her way to Elm Grove, where she had arranged to meet Raymond. He was waiting by Thornfield House's gates, looking pleased with himself. I've had a productive morning, he announced. My contact at the council offices was most helpful. Reginald Percival Ashworth has been paying council tax on Thornfield House for 5 years. The payments come from a bank account at Barclays in Kensington. The same area as his postal redirect, Miss Marple noted. What else did you discover? This is where it gets interesting. The council tax account was set up with a solicitor's letter stating that Mr. Ashworth was the new tenant under a private rental agreement with the Bradshaw estate. But when I contacted Pemberton, the estate's actual solicitor, he knew nothing about any rental agreement. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles thoughtfully. So someone forged legal documents to establish Ashworth's residency. That suggests considerable planning and legal knowledge. They walked slowly along Elm Grove, while Raymond consulted his notebook. I also checked with the electoral register. Ashworth registered to vote here 5 years ago, listing his occupation as retired civil servant. He's never actually voted, but his registration is renewed annually. A very thorough phantom, Miss Marple observed. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to create a complete paper identity, but why here? Why St. Mary Mead? Perhaps because it's quiet. A place where a reclusive resident wouldn't attract attention. Miss Marple paused at Mrs. Emmett's cottage, where the elderly woman was feeding her cats in the front garden. Mrs. Emmett, dear, might I ask you something? In all of the time you've been watching Thornfield House, have you ever seen any deliveries? Grocery vans, perhaps? Or the postman? Mrs. Emmett straightened, clearly delighted to be consulted again. Now that you mention it, no. Never seen a delivery van. Never seen the postman go up that drive. Though ... she frowned, stroking a tabby cat. There was something odd about 3 months ago. A man came asking questions, just like you're doing now. What sort of man? Raymond asked, pen poised. Ordinary-looking fellow, middle-aged. Said he was from the insurance company, checking on the property. But he seemed more interested in whether anyone lived there than in the building's condition. Asked specifically if I'd ever seen a Mr. Ashworth. Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October breeze. What did you tell him? The truth? That I'd never seen hide nor hair of anyone by that name? He seemed relieved, if you ask me, thanked me very politely, and left in a hurry. As they walked back toward the village centre, Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly. Someone had created Reginald Ashworth with meticulous care, establishing residency, paying taxes, maintaining utilities, even registering to vote. Yet this phantom had been designed to remain invisible to the actual residents of St. Mary Mead. Raymond, she said suddenly, what if Ashworth wasn't meant to be a real person at all? What if he was meant to be a sort of legal fiction? You mean like a shell company? Precisely. A name that exists only on paper for some specific purpose. She paused outside the village bank, struck by a sudden thought. I wonder, do you suppose Mr. Pemberton at the bank might be willing to discuss Mr. Ashworth's account? The bank manager, a nervous man named Pemberton, who shared a surname with the estate solicitor but no relation, was initially reluctant to discuss any customer's affairs. However, Miss Marple's gentle persistence and Raymond's legal credentials eventually loosened his tongue. It's highly irregular, he admitted, glancing around his small office. But given the circumstances, Mr. Ashworth's account has always puzzled me. Large cash deposits, always in round numbers, £5,000, £10,000. Never any cheques written, never any card transactions. Just cash in and automatic payments out for utilities and taxes. How often were these deposits made? Miss Marple asked. Monthly, like clockwork, always on the 15th. But here's the strangest part. The deposit stopped 3 months ago. The account has been running down ever since, just paying the automatic bills. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful look with Raymond. 3 months ago, around the time someone had been asking Mrs. Emmett about Ashworth, and when the mysterious visitor had come to the library asking about local maps. As they left the bank, Miss Marple felt the familiar tingle of a mystery deepening. Reginald Ashworth had been more than a phantom. He had been a carefully constructed financial entity, receiving regular cash payments for some unknown purpose. And now Just as mysteriously as he had appeared, he had vanished from the world of the living. But someone had placed that obituary. Someone wanted the world to know that Reginald Ashworth was officially dead. The question was, who and why? "I think," Miss Marple said quietly as they reached her cottage gate, "we need to discover what Mr. Ashworth was being paid for. Because in my experience, people don't pay large sums of money to phantoms without expecting something very real in return." Chapter 4. The Body in the Garden. The discovery came at dawn on Thursday, when young Tommy Fletcher, the village's most notorious truant, decided to explore the forbidden territory of Thornfield House's overgrown garden. What began as a schoolboy's adventure in search of blackberries ended with his terrified screams echoing across Elm Grove. Miss Marple was enjoying her morning tea when the commotion began. Through her kitchen window, she could see people gathering near Thornfield House, their voices carrying on the crisp autumn air. By the time she had donned her coat and walking stick, Inspector Slack's police car was already pulling up to the gates. "Miss Marple!" Tommy Fletcher ran toward her, his face pale and streaked with tears. "There's a dead man in the garden, all covered with leaves and brambles." Inspector Slack, looking harried as usual, was attempting to establish order, while Dr. Haydock knelt beside something hidden in the tangled undergrowth near the house's east wall. Miss Marple approached quietly, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The body lay partially concealed beneath a mound of fallen leaves and overgrown ivy. It was clearly not a recent death. The clothes were damp and stained, and there was an unmistakable odour of decay despite the cool weather. But what immediately caught Miss Marple's attention was the man's appearance. Well dressed in a good quality suit, expensive shoes, and a gold watch still gleaming on his wrist. "Been here at least 3 weeks, I'd say," Dr. Haydock announced, standing and brushing dirt from his knees. "Possibly longer. The cool weather has preserved things somewhat." "Any identification?" Inspector Slack asked, pulling on rubber gloves with obvious reluctance. Dr. Haydock carefully searched the body's pockets, producing a leather wallet. "Thomas Hartley," he read from a driving licence. "Address in Bloomsbury, London. Born 1965, so he'd be 58 years old." Miss Marple stepped closer, ignoring Inspector Slack's disapproving look. "May I see the wallet, Inspector?" Slack hesitated, then handed it over. The wallet contained the usual items: credit cards, a few £20 notes, business cards identifying Thomas Hartley as a solicitor specialising in confidential legal services. But it was what Miss Marple found tucked behind the notes that made her pulse quicken. A brass key, old-fashioned and heavy, with the distinctive shape of a Victorian house key. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe this key may fit Thornfield House." Before Slack could object, Raymond appeared at her elbow. He had arrived with the small crowd of villagers drawn by the excitement, and his legal training made him invaluable in such situations. "The key does look like it would fit an old lock," he agreed, examining it carefully. "But how would a London solicitor have a key to an empty house in St. Mary Mead?" Dr. Haydock was conducting a more thorough examination of the body. "No obvious signs of violence," he reported. "No wounds, no obvious trauma. Could be natural causes, though the circumstances are certainly suspicious." "What's that in his hand?" Miss Marple asked, pointing to the corpse's tightly clenched right fist. With some difficulty, Dr. Haydock pried open the fingers to reveal a torn piece of photograph. The fragment showed parts of several people standing together, but most of the image was missing. What remained showed a woman's hand wearing a distinctive ring, and part of a man's face in profile. "Curious," Inspector Slack muttered, bagging the photograph fragment. "Looks like he was trying to hold on to this when he died." Miss Marple studied the scene carefully. The body lay near a section of the garden wall where the ivy grew thickest, providing natural concealment. But the position seemed wrong somehow. Too neat, too carefully arranged. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "might I suggest we test that key? If Mr. Hartley had access to Thornfield House, it could explain his presence here." Reluctantly, Slack agreed. The small procession made its way to the house's main entrance, where Raymond carefully inserted the key into the old lock. It turned smoothly, with the ease of recent use. The front door swung open to reveal a dusty hallway that clearly hadn't been properly inhabited for years. But Miss Marple's keen eyes immediately noticed several telling details: footprints in the dust, recently disturbed cobwebs, and most significantly, a small table near the door that held a stack of unopened mail. "Someone has been using this house," she announced, stepping carefully into the hallway. "And recently." The mail was addressed to R.P. Ashworth, confirming what they had already suspected. But as they explored further, they discovered something far more intriguing. A small study off the main hallway that showed clear signs of recent occupation. The desk held papers, pens, and a telephone that, when Raymond tested it, proved to be connected and working. "This is extraordinary," Raymond said, examining the papers on the desk. "These appear to be legal documents, contracts, agreements, all bearing Ashworth's signature." Inspector Slack was growing increasingly agitated. "This is all very irregular. We have a dead body, an empty house that isn't empty, and a man who doesn't exist but apparently conducts business." Miss Marple was examining the telephone more closely. "Inspector, I think you should check the recent calls on this line. Mr. Hartley may have been in contact with someone before his death." While Slack made arrangements for the telephone records, Miss Marple continued her careful examination of the study. In the desk drawer she found something that made her catch her breath. A photograph, clearly the complete version of the fragment found in Hartley's hand. The photograph showed 5 people at what appeared to be some sort of professional gathering. She recognized one face immediately. It was Julia Morrison, Mrs. Bantry's houseguest, who had arrived in the village just days before Ashworth's obituary appeared. Another face belonged to a man she had seen around the village but couldn't immediately place. "Raymond," she called softly, "I think we need to have another conversation with Mrs. Bantry's guest." As the police continued their investigation of the house and garden, Miss Marple stood in the dusty hallway, pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a pattern in her mind. Thomas Hartley, a London solicitor, had possessed a key to a house supposedly empty for 5 years. He had been carrying a photograph that connected him to at least one person currently in St. Mary Mead. And he had died while the mysterious Reginald Ashworth was still supposedly alive. "Inspector," she said as Slack emerged from the study, "I believe Mr. Hartley's death may not be as natural as it appears. Someone wanted him silenced, and they used Thornfield House as the perfect hiding place. After all, who would look for a body in a house where no one was supposed to live?" The autumn sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows across the overgrown garden where Thomas Hartley had met his end. But Miss Marple was certain that his death was just the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous mystery, one that threatened to shatter the peaceful facade of St. Mary Mead. As she walked home, the torn photograph safely tucked in her handbag, she reflected on the curious fact that sometimes the dead could tell you more than the living. Thomas Hartley might be beyond questioning, but the secrets he had died protecting were very much alive and growing more dangerous by the hour. Chapter 5. The Solicitor's Secret. The journey to London the following morning found Miss Marple and Raymond on the early train from Much Benham, the nearest station to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had insisted on accompanying her nephew, despite his protests about the propriety of involving an elderly lady in what was clearly becoming a murder investigation. "Nonsense, dear," she had said firmly while packing her handbag with characteristic efficiency. "Mr. Hartley's secretary is far more likely to confide in a harmless old woman than in a policeman or even a fellow solicitor. People tell me things, Raymond. It's one of my few useful talents." The address in Bloomsbury led them to a narrow Georgian building squeezed between a bookshop and a small café. The brass nameplate beside the door read, "Hartley and Associates, Confidential Legal Services," in discreet lettering that suggested discretion was, indeed, the firm's primary commodity. The receptionist who answered their ring was a woman in her 40s, with prematurely grey hair and red-rimmed eyes that spoke of recent tears. She introduced herself as Miss Peterson and led them into a small, cluttered office that smelled of old leather and anxiety. "I've been expecting someone to come," she said, settling behind a desk piled high with files. "When Mr. Hartley didn't return from his trip, and then the police called yesterday, I knew something terrible had happened." Miss Marple accepted the offered cup of tea and studied Miss Peterson with sympathetic eyes. "You must have worked closely with Mr. Hartley. This must be a dreadful shock." 15 years I've been with him," Miss Peterson replied, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "He was a good man, Miss Marple, whatever people might think about the nature of his work. He helped people who had nowhere else to turn." "What exactly was the nature of his work?" Raymond asked gently, pulling out his notebook. Miss Peterson glanced nervously toward the window before answering. "Mr. Hartley specialized in difficult situations, people who needed to disappear to start fresh, witness protection cases that fell through the cracks, women fleeing abusive husbands, people threatened by criminals. He helped them create new identities, legal ones." "Legal?" Miss Marple inquired, raising an eyebrow. "Oh yes, completely above board. Mr. Hartley was very careful about that. He worked with the proper authorities, had connections in the Home Office, but sometimes the official channels moved too slowly, or couldn't help certain cases. That's where Mr. Hartley stepped in." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "It must have been dangerous work. Did he ever mention feeling threatened?" Miss Peterson's composure cracked slightly. "These past few months, yes. He'd been receiving phone calls that upset him terribly. Always hung up when I answered. But when Mr. Hartley took them, he'd go quite pale. Started locking his office door, which he'd never done before." "Did he say who was calling?" Raymond asked. "Not directly, but I gathered it was someone from his past. A client, perhaps, or someone connected to a client. He kept muttering about chickens coming home to roost, and how he should have been more careful about who he helped." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Miss Peterson, had Mr. Hartley ever mentioned the name Reginald Ashworth?" The effect was immediate and dramatic. Miss Peterson went completely white and nearly dropped her teacup. Where did you hear that name?" "So you do know it," Miss Marple said gently. "Please, my dear, this could be very important. Mr. Hartley is dead, and we believe his death may be connected to Mr. Ashworth." Miss Peterson stood abruptly and walked to a filing cabinet, her hands shaking as she unlocked it. She withdrew a thick folder marked Confidential RPA and placed it on the desk. "I probably shouldn't show you this," she said, "but if Mr. Hartley is really dead, Reginald Ashworth was one of his most complex cases. Not a real person, you understand, but what Mr. Hartley called a paper identity. He created it about 5 years ago. Raymond examined the file with professional interest. This is incredibly detailed. Birth certificate, national insurance number, passport application, even school records going back decades. Mr. Hartley was thorough, Miss Peterson said with a mixture of pride and worry. But the Ashworth identity was different from his usual work. Most of his clients needed new identities to escape danger. Ashworth was created for someone who wanted to conduct business without being traced. What sort of business? Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. I was never told specifically, but there were large cash payments involved. Monthly deposits into accounts Mr. Hartley had set up. The client paid him very well for maintaining the Ashworth identity and keeping it completely separate from any real person. Miss Marple studied the photograph she had found at Thornfield House, now lying on Miss Peterson's desk. Do you recognize anyone in this picture? Miss Peterson examined it carefully, then pointed to a woman in the background. That's Mrs. Morrison, Julia Morrison. She was one of Mr. Hartley's legitimate clients, a woman fleeing an abusive marriage. He helped her create a new identity about 6 months ago. And this man? Miss Marple indicated another face in the photograph. I'm not certain, but I think, yes, that's Mr. Fitzgerald. He came to see Mr. Hartley several times recently. Always very agitated, always insisting on seeing him privately. Mr. Hartley seemed quite nervous after those meetings. Raymond was taking careful notes. Do you have an address for this Mr. Fitzgerald? Miss Peterson consulted her appointment book. He never gave a permanent address, but he mentioned he dealt in antiques, had shops in several locations, including some village Mary something. St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple suggested, her pulse quickening. Yes, that's it. He said he was expanding his business there, looking for a quiet place to, what was his phrase, conduct certain transactions without interference. The pieces were beginning to fall into place in Miss Marple's mind. An antique dealer who needed privacy for certain transactions, a solicitor who specialized in creating false identities, and a phantom resident of an empty house where large cash deposits were made monthly. Miss Peterson, she said carefully, did Mr. Hartley ever suggest that he was being blackmailed? The secretary's face crumpled. Not in so many words, but yes, I think he was. These past few weeks, he kept talking about paying for past mistakes, and how some clients never really go away. He was terrified, Miss Marple. Absolutely terrified. As they prepared to leave, Miss Peterson handed Raymond a small address book. These are Mr. Hartley's contacts, people he worked with, clients he helped. If someone killed him, the answer might be in there. On the train back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat quietly, watching the countryside roll past while her mind worked through the implications of what they had learned. Thomas Hartley had created Reginald Ashworth as a cover identity for someone conducting questionable business. But somewhere along the way, the relationship had soured, and Hartley had become a liability. Raymond, she said suddenly, I think we need to pay a visit to Mr. Fitzgerald's antique shop, and we need to have another conversation with Julia Morrison, because I'm beginning to suspect that Mr. Hartley's death wasn't just about silencing him, it was about closing down the Ashworth identity permanently. The train pulled into Much Benham Station as the autumn sun was setting, casting long shadows across the platform. Miss Marple gathered her handbag and walking stick, her mind already planning the next phase of her investigation. Thomas Hartley had died protecting secrets. But those secrets were about to be exposed, whether his killer liked it or not. Chapter 6. The Torn Photograph. The following morning brought one of those grey, drizzling days that made St. Mary Mead look particularly melancholy. Miss Marple sat in her morning room, the torn photograph spread before her on a small table alongside a magnifying glass that had belonged to her late father. The fragment found in Thomas Hartley's hand was proving more revealing than she had initially thought. Under magnification, she could make out several crucial details. The distinctive Art Deco pattern of a hotel carpet in the background, a partial view of what appeared to be a legal conference banner, and most intriguingly, a woman's hand wearing a very unusual ring, a Celtic knot design with what looked like emeralds. Most illuminating, she murmured to herself, just as Cherry announced that Raymond had arrived with Inspector Slack in tow. Miss Marple, Slack began without preamble. I've had the telephone records from Thornfield House analysed. Very interesting results. He settled into her chintz armchair with the air of a man bearing important news. 3 calls were made from that house in the week before Hartley's death. 2 to London numbers, 1 to Hartley's office, 1 to a number registered to something called Discretion Services Limited. The 3rd call was local. Local? Miss Marple set down her magnifying glass with interest. To the antique shop on the High Street. Fitzgerald's Fine Antiques. Call lasted 12 minutes, made the day before Hartley disappeared. Raymond consulted his notebook. That confirms what Miss Peterson told us. Fitzgerald was definitely one of Hartley's contacts. Miss Marple stood and moved to her window, gazing thoughtfully toward the village centre. I think it's time we paid Mr. Fitzgerald a visit. But first, Inspector, might I suggest we speak with Mrs. Morrison again? I have some questions about this photograph. They found Julia Morrison in Mrs. Bantry's garden, helping with the autumn clean-up. She looked up nervously as they approached, her hands stilling on the rake she'd been using to gather fallen leaves. Mrs. Morrison, Miss Marple began gently, we've discovered that you knew Thomas Hartley quite well. This photograph was found among his possessions. She produced the complete photograph from Thornfield House. Julia Morrison's face went completely white, and she dropped the rake with a clatter. Yes, I knew Mr. Hartley. He helped me when I needed to start over, but I don't understand what this has to do with anything. When was this photograph taken? Inspector Slack asked, his tone more official than Miss Marple's gentle approach. About 8 months ago. It was a conference for people in difficult situations. Mr. Hartley organised it, said it would help us understand our legal options. Julia's voice was barely above a whisper. Miss Marple studied the woman's face carefully. Mrs. Morrison, I notice you're wearing a very distinctive ring. Celtic knot design with emeralds. Julia instinctively covered her right hand with her left. It was my grandmother's, the only thing I kept when I had to leave my old life behind. It's quite beautiful, Miss Marple said, then added casually, I believe it appears in this photograph as well. The effect was immediate. Julia Morrison sank onto Mrs. Bantry's garden bench, her composure finally cracking completely. You don't understand, she said, tears beginning to flow. I never meant for any of this to happen. Mr. Hartley was trying to help me, but then everything went wrong. Raymond sat beside her, offering his handkerchief. What went wrong, Mrs. Morrison? The conference. It wasn't just for legitimate clients. There were others there, people who were using Mr. Hartley's services for illegal purposes. I recognized one of them, a man who dealt in stolen art. My ex-husband had done business with him. Miss Marple felt the familiar tingle of pieces falling into place. This man, was his name Fitzgerald? Julia nodded miserably. He was using false identities to move stolen artwork across Europe. Mr. Hartley had created several identities for him, including one for a base of operations in a quiet English village. St. Mary Mead, Inspector Slack said grimly. Yes, but Mr. Hartley started having second thoughts. He realized he was being used to facilitate serious crimes, not just help people escape danger. He told me he was going to shut down some of the identities he'd created. Miss Marple sat on the bench's other side, her voice gentle but insistent. And Mr. Fitzgerald didn't want his operations disrupted. Exactly. At the conference, I overheard them arguing. Fitzgerald was threatening Mr. Hartley, saying he knew too much about all of them to back out now. That's when someone took this photograph. We were all standing together, trying to look like we were just having a pleasant conversation. But you kept in touch with Mr. Hartley afterward? Raymond asked. Julia nodded. He was worried about me. Said if anything happened to him, I should contact the police. He gave me a key to a safety deposit box in London. Said it contained evidence about all his clients' real identities. Inspector Slack leaned forward, intently. Do you still have this key? It's hidden in my room at Mrs. Bantry's. Mr. Hartley made me promise to keep it safe. She looked up at Miss Marple with frightened eyes. You think Mr. Fitzgerald killed him, don't you? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that Mr. Hartley became a liability to someone who had a great deal to lose if their true activities were exposed. They left Julia Morrison in Mrs. Bantry's capable hands and made their way to the High Street, where Fitzgerald's fine antiques occupied a narrow building between the chemist and a tea shop. The window display showed an eclectic mix of furniture, paintings, and decorative objects that spoke of expensive tastes and international sources. A bell chimed as they entered, and a man emerged from the back room, middle-aged, well-dressed, with the smooth manner of someone accustomed to dealing with wealthy clients. Miss Marple recognized him immediately from the photograph. "Good morning," he said with professional warmth. "How may I help you?" "Mr. Fitzgerald?" Inspector Slack showed his warrant card. "We'd like to ask you some questions about Thomas Hartley." The change in Fitzgerald's demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable. His smile became fixed, and his eyes grew wary. "I'm afraid I don't know anyone by that name," he said smoothly. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice deceptively mild. "How curious! We have telephone records showing a 12-minute conversation between your shop and Thornfield House just before Mr. Hartley's disappearance." Fitzgerald's composure slipped slightly. "Thornfield House? But that's been empty for years. There must be some mistake." "No mistake, Mr. Fitzgerald," Raymond said, consulting his notes. "The call was traced directly to this number." For a moment, the antique dealer seemed to be weighing his options. Then his shoulders sagged slightly, and Miss Marple knew they had found their man. "Perhaps," she said gently, "you'd like to tell us about your business arrangement with the late Mr. Reginald Ashworth?" The game, as her nephew might say, was finally afoot in earnest. Chapter 7. The Houseguest's Tale. The afternoon found Miss Marple, Raymond, and Inspector Slack gathered in Mrs. Bantry's comfortable sitting room, where Julia Morrison sat curled in a corner of the sofa like a frightened animal. Mrs. Bantry herself had tactfully withdrawn to the kitchen, though Miss Marple suspected she was listening at the door, a habit that had served them both well in previous mysteries. "Mrs. Morrison," Miss Marple began gently, settling into her chair with her knitting bag, "I think it would help everyone if you told us the complete truth about your relationship with Mr. Hartley, and how you came to be in St. Mary Mead." Julia Morrison twisted her grandmother's ring nervously, the emeralds catching the pale afternoon light. "It's a long story, and not a pleasant one." "We have time," Inspector Slack said, though his tone was kinder than usual. Even he seemed to recognize that this frightened woman was more victim than perpetrator. Julia took a shaky breath and began. "My real name is Julia Pemberton. I was married to Marcus Pemberton for 8 years. 8 years of hell. He was involved with some very dangerous people. Art thieves and smugglers mostly. I didn't know at first. Thought he was just a successful businessman." She paused to accept a cup of tea from Mrs. Bantry, who had appeared with a tray despite her supposed absence. "When did you realize the truth?" Raymond asked, his pen poised over his notebook. "About 2 years ago. I found documents in his study, invoices for paintings that I knew had been stolen from museums, correspondence with people using obviously false names. When I confronted him, he hurt me, badly, said if I ever tried to leave or go to the police, he'd kill me." Miss Marple's needles clicked sympathetically. "But you did leave eventually." "I tried to, several times, but Marcus had connections everywhere. Police, customs officials, even some judges. Every time I thought I'd escaped, he'd find me. The last time," she shuddered, "he broke 3 of my ribs and promised the next beating would be fatal." "How did you find Mr. Hartley?" Inspector Slack asked. "Through a women's shelter in London. They gave me his card. Said he specialized in helping people disappear legally. When I met him, he was so kind, so understanding. He said he could create a completely new identity for me, one that Marcus would never be able to trace." Julia stood and walked to the window, gazing out at Mrs. Bantry's peaceful garden. "Mr. Hartley was very thorough. New birth certificate, national insurance number, even a complete employment history. He said the key was to create a past that would stand up to scrutiny while keeping me completely separate from my old life." "But something went wrong," Miss Marple observed. "Yes. About 6 months ago, Mr. Hartley called me in a panic. He said he'd discovered that some of his other clients were using his services for criminal purposes. He was particularly worried about a man named Fitzgerald, who was using multiple identities to smuggle stolen artwork." Raymond looked up from his notes. Did he explain the connection? Fitzgerald had been one of Marcus's associates. Mr. Hartley was terrified that if Fitzgerald was caught, the investigation would expose all of his clients, including me. He said Marcus would find me within days. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "So Mr. Hartley suggested you come to St. Mary Mead. He said it would be the safest place to hide while he sorted things out. He'd created an identity called Reginald Ashworth, who supposedly lived here, and he thought if I stayed in the village, I'd be protected by proximity, I suppose. If anyone came looking for Ashworth's associates, they'd find a harmless woman staying with a respectable family." "But you never actually met this Ashworth?" Inspector Slack asked. Julia shook her head. Mr. Hartley explained that Ashworth was what he called a paper ghost, an identity that existed only on documents. He used it to conduct business that needed to be kept separate from his real clients. Mrs. Bantry, who had been listening from the doorway, finally entered the room properly. "My dear, you should have told me all this when you arrived. I would have understood." "I couldn't risk it," Julia said, tears beginning to flow again. "Mr. Hartley made me promise not to tell anyone the truth unless something happened to him. He said the fewer people who knew, the safer everyone would be." Miss Marple leaned forward intently, When did you last speak with Mr. Hartley? 3 weeks ago. He called to say he was coming to St. Mary Mead to close down some operations. He sounded frightened, said he'd discovered that Fitzgerald was using Thornfield House for more than just a mailing address. Apparently, he'd been storing stolen artwork there. Did Mr. Hartley say anything else? Raymond asked. He told me to be very careful, to stay close to Mrs. Bantry, and if anything happened to him, to give the police the key to his safety deposit box. He said it contained evidence about all his clients, the legitimate ones and the criminals. Inspector Slack sat forward. You mentioned this key yesterday. Do you still have it? Julia nodded and left the room, returning moments later with a small brass key. Box 247 at the Kensington branch of Lloyd's Bank. Mr. Hartley said it contained copies of all the documents he'd created, plus evidence of the illegal activities he'd uncovered. Miss Marple examined the key thoughtfully. Mrs. Morrison, did Mr. Hartley ever mention being blackmailed? Not exactly, but he did say something odd the last time we spoke. He said he'd made a terrible mistake by keeping records of everything, that his thoroughness had become a weapon that could be used against him. What did he mean? Mrs. Bantry asked. I think, Julia said slowly, that someone was threatening to expose all his clients unless he continued to provide services. The legitimate clients like me would be found by the people we were hiding from, while the criminals would be arrested. Either way, lives would be destroyed. Miss Marple's needles had stopped clicking entirely. So Mr. Hartley was trapped. He couldn't stop providing services to criminals without endangering innocent people, but continuing meant becoming an accessory to serious crimes. Exactly. And I think that's why he decided to come to St. Mary Mead personally. He was going to shut down the Ashworth identity and destroy the evidence stored at Thornfield House, even if it meant exposing himself to danger. Inspector Slack stood abruptly. We need to get to that safety deposit box immediately. If Hartley documented everything, we'll have evidence against Fitzgerald and possibly others. As they prepared to leave for London, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of the situation. Thomas Hartley had died trying to protect the very people he'd spent his career helping. But his death had also provided them with the key, literally, to unravelling the entire conspiracy. Mrs. Morrison, she said gently, you've been very brave. But I'm afraid your ordeal isn't over yet. If we're right about Mr. Fitzgerald, he may realise that you know too much about his operations. Julia Morrison's face went pale, but her voice was steady when she replied. Then we'd better make sure he's caught before he realises it. Miss Marple smiled approvingly. Sometimes, she reflected, the most frightened people proved to be the most courageous when the moment demanded it. Chapter 8. The Bank Manager's Revelation. The morning train to London carried an unusually sombre group of passengers. Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, watching the countryside blur past while her mind worked through the implications of Julia Morrison's revelations. Beside her, Raymond reviewed his notes, and across the aisle, Inspector Slack spoke in hushed tones on his mobile phone, arranging for the proper warrants to access Thomas Hartley's safety deposit box. The Kensington branch of Lloyd's Bank was an imposing Victorian building that spoke of old money and older secrets. The manager, Mr. Whitfield, was a thin, nervous man who clearly found the presence of police in his establishment deeply unsettling. "This is most irregular," he repeated for the third time as he led them down to the vault. Mr. Hartley was very specific about the security arrangements for this box. Only he or the designated keyholder were to have access. "Mr. Hartley is dead," Inspector Slack said bluntly, "and Mrs. Morrison is the designated keyholder. I think that qualifies as irregular circumstances." The safety deposit box was larger than Miss Marple had expected, and when opened, it revealed a treasure trove of documents that made even Raymond whistle softly. Thick folders contained complete identity packages, birth certificates, passports, employment histories, even school records going back decades. "Good heavens," Miss Marple murmured, examining one particularly thick file. Mr. Hartley was extraordinarily thorough. Julia Morrison, who had insisted on accompanying them despite Inspector Slack's reservations, pointed to a red folder marked Urgent Criminal Activities. Mr. Hartley said this contained evidence of the illegal operations he'd discovered. The contents were damning. Photographs of stolen artwork, correspondence between Fitzgerald and various European dealers, shipping manifests for items that had been reported stolen from museums and private collections. Most significantly, there were detailed records of payments made through the Reginald Ashworth accounts. "Look at this," Raymond said, holding up a bank statement. "Monthly deposits of £10,000, always in cash, going back 5 years. The money was then transferred to accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands." Inspector Slack was photographing documents with methodical efficiency. "This is enough to put Fitzgerald away for decades. International art theft, money laundering, conspiracy." But Miss Marple was studying something else, a handwritten note in what she assumed was Hartley's careful script. "RPA identity compromised. F suspects I have evidence. Must close operation before innocent clients are exposed. If something happens to me, contact Inspector Morrison, Scotland Yard Art Crime Unit." "Inspector Morrison," she said aloud. "Julia, is that a coincidence?" Julia Morrison looked up from the documents she was examining. "No, he's my brother-in-law. My husband's younger brother, but they've been estranged for years. David Morrison joined the police specifically to fight the kind of crimes Marcus was involved in." "Did Mr. Hartley know about this connection?" Raymond asked. "Yes, I told him when we first met. He said it might be useful to have a contact in the art crime unit, but we agreed it was too dangerous to involve David while Marcus was still looking for me." Miss Marple felt another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. But if Mr. Hartley was planning to expose Fitzgerald's operation, he would need police support. Perhaps he was planning to contact your brother-in-law. They spent another hour cataloguing the contents of the safety deposit box, but it was a smaller discovery that proved most illuminating. Hidden in the back of the box was a microcassette recorder and several tapes labelled with dates from the past 6 months. "Mr. Hartley recorded his conversations," Inspector Slack said, holding up one of the tapes. "This could be the evidence we need." Back at the hotel where they had taken rooms for the night, they listened to the tapes on Raymond's portable recorder. Thomas Hartley's voice, cultured and careful, filled the small room as he documented his growing concerns about his criminal clients. The most recent tape, dated just a week before his death, was particularly revealing. "Fitzgerald called again today. He's becoming increasingly aggressive, demanding that I create additional identities for what he calls expanding operations. When I refused, he reminded me that he knows the real identities of all my legitimate clients, including several women hiding from abusive partners. He's essentially blackmailing me. Continue to provide services or watch innocent people suffer." Hartley's voice grew more strained as the recording continued. "I've decided I have no choice but to shut down the entire operation. I'll travel to St. Mary Mead tomorrow to clear out the Thornfield House facility and destroy any evidence stored there. If Fitzgerald wants to expose my client, so be it. I can't continue to be an accessory to international art theft. The tape ended with a chilling final entry. I've just received another call. Fitzgerald knows I'm planning to close the operation. He's threatened to kill me if I don't reconsider. I'm going to contact Inspector Morrison at Scotland Yard. If something happens to me, at least the authorities will know where to look. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, the full scope of the tragedy now clear. Mr. Hartley was trying to do the right thing, but he was trapped by his own compassion. He couldn't expose the criminals without endangering the innocent people he'd helped. And Fitzgerald knew it, Inspector Slack added grimly. He was using Hartley's legitimate clients as human shields. Julia Morrison was crying quietly. Mr. Hartley died trying to protect people like me. If I hadn't needed his help— Nonsense, dear, Miss Marple said firmly. Mr. Hartley chose to help you because it was the right thing to do. The fault lies entirely with those who perverted his good intentions for criminal purposes. Raymond was studying the bank. Statements again. There's something else here. Look at these withdrawal patterns. Large cash amounts taken out monthly, always on the same date as the deposits. But the withdrawals stopped 3 months ago, while the deposits continued until just recently. What does that suggest? Inspector Slack asked. That someone else gained access to the Ashworth accounts, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Perhaps Fitzgerald discovered he didn't need Mr. Hartley's cooperation to access the money. The implications were chilling. If Fitzgerald had found a way to access the accounts independently, then Thomas Hartley had become not just an inconvenience, but a direct threat to a very profitable operation. As they prepared for the journey back to St. Mary Mead the next morning, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of deception they had uncovered. Thomas Hartley had created Reginald Ashworth as a tool to help vulnerable people, but that same creation had been corrupted into an instrument of international crime. Inspector, she said as they boarded the train, I think we need to move quickly. If Mr. Fitzgerald realizes we've discovered his operation, he may try to eliminate any remaining evidence or witnesses. Inspector Slack nodded grimly. I've already contacted the local force. Fitzgerald's shop is under surveillance, and we have warrants ready for his arrest. But Miss Marple was thinking of something else. The careful way Fitzgerald had maintained his cover in St. Mary Mead, the methodical planning that had gone into the Ashworth identity, the cold calculation that had led to Thomas Hartley's murder. This was not a man who would go quietly. I fear, she said softly as the train pulled away from London, that Mr. Fitzgerald has one more card to play, and I suspect it will be the most dangerous one of all. Chapter 9. The Midnight Visitor. The return to St. Mary Mead found the village wrapped in an unseasonably thick fog that seemed to muffle sound and blur the familiar landmarks into ghostly shapes. Miss Marple stood at her bedroom window that evening, watching the mist swirl around the street lamps like something from a Gothic novel. It was, she reflected, entirely appropriate weather for what she suspected would be a night of revelations. Inspector Slack had positioned surveillance teams around Fitzgerald's antique shop and Thornfield House, but Miss Marple had her own plans. At 10:30, she donned her darkest coat and most sensible shoes, picked up a small torch, and slipped quietly out of her cottage. Really, Aunt Jane, Raymond whispered from the shadows by her garden gate, you didn't think I'd let you do this alone, did you? Miss Marple was not entirely surprised to find her nephew waiting for her. I suppose it would be useless to suggest you go home and let the police handle this. Completely useless, Raymond confirmed, falling into step beside her. Besides, you'll need someone to call for help if things go wrong. They made their way through the fog-shrouded streets, their footsteps muffled by the thick mist. Elm Grove was particularly eerie, the bare branches of the trees creating twisted shadows that seemed to reach toward them. Like grasping fingers, Thornfield House loomed ahead, darker and more forbidding than ever. Miss Marple had chosen her position carefully. A small copse of trees across from the house that provided excellent concealment while offering a clear view of both the main entrance and the garden. They settled in to wait, Raymond checking his mobile phone to ensure he could summon help if needed. The fog seemed to deepen as the night progressed, and Miss Marple was beginning to wonder if her instincts had been wrong when she heard the soft purr of a car engine. A dark sedan materialized out of the mist, its headlights cutting pale swathes through the gloom as it approached Thornfield House. "There," she whispered, touching Raymond's arm. The car stopped just outside the gates, and a figure emerged, tall, wearing a dark coat and hat that made identification impossible in the fog. But the way the person moved, the confident stride toward the gates, suggested someone very familiar with the property. They watched as the figure produced a key and unlocked the gates with practiced ease, then returned to drive the car through before carefully relocking them. The vehicle disappeared around the side of the house, presumably to a concealed parking area. "Should we call Inspector Slack now?" Raymond whispered. Miss Marple shook her head. "Not yet, dear. We need to see what they're doing first." Minutes passed before they saw a light appear in one of the ground floor windows. Not the steady glow of electric lighting, but the flickering beam of a torch. The light moved from room to room with purposeful efficiency, as if the person inside knew exactly what they were looking for. "They're searching for something," Miss Marple observed, "or perhaps removing evidence." The light disappeared for nearly 20 minutes, then reappeared in what Miss Marple judged to be the cellar, based on the faint glow visible through a small window. At ground level, when it emerged again, it was accompanied by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. "Now I think we should investigate," Miss Marple said, rising stiffly from her concealment. They approached Thornfield House with extreme caution, using the fog as cover. The front door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap they could hear sounds of activity from somewhere deep within the house. The scraping of furniture being moved, the rustle of papers, and occasionally a muttered curse. Miss Marple tested the door carefully and found it opened silently on well-oiled hinges. The hallway beyond was pitch black, but she could see a faint glow emanating from what she remembered as the study where they had found Ashworth's papers. They crept forward, Raymond's hand on her shoulder for guidance in the darkness. As they drew closer to the study, the sounds became clearer. Someone was systematically destroying documents, the rustle of papers being torn, and the scratch of a match being struck. Miss Marple peered around the doorframe and gasped softly. The study had been transformed into a scene of organized destruction. File cabinets stood open, their contents scattered across the floor. A small fire burned in the fireplace, fed by a steady stream of documents being fed into the flames. But it was the figure tending the fire that made her catch her breath. It wasn't Fitzgerald at all. It was Dr. Morrison, the young partner who had recently joined Dr. Haydock's practice. "Dr. Morrison," she said quietly, stepping into the room. The young doctor spun around, his face pale in the firelight. In his hand was a thick folder marked with what appeared to be medical records. "Miss Marple, what are you doing here?" "I might ask you the same question, Doctor, though I suspect I'm beginning to understand." She moved closer, noting the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "You're Julia Morrison's brother-in-law, aren't you?" The Inspector Morrison that Mr. Hartley mentioned in his notes. Dr. Morrison's shoulders sagged, and he sank into a chair, still clutching the folder. "You don't understand. I never meant for any of this to happen." Raymond had positioned himself near the door, his mobile phone ready. "Dr. Morrison, I think you should explain what you're doing here." "I was trying to protect Julia," the doctor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "When she contacted me 3 weeks ago, she was terrified. She said Hartley was dead, and that she was afraid Fitzgerald would come after her next." Miss Marple settled into another chair, her voice gentle but insistent. "So, you came here to destroy evidence? Julia gave me a key. Said Hartley had told her there was a backup set of records hidden here. I thought if I could destroy them, Fitzgerald would have no reason to hurt her." "But that's not all you found, is it?" Miss Marple asked, noting the medical folder in his hands. Dr. Morrison's face crumpled. "Number, I found these. Medical records that Hartley had been keeping. Records of treatments I'd provided to people using false identities." The truth hit Miss Marple like a physical blow. You were helping Mr. Hartley create medical histories for his clients. "It started innocently enough," Dr. Morrison said, tears beginning to flow. "Hartley contacted me through Julia, said he had clients who needed medical care, but couldn't use their real names. Abused women, people in witness protection. I thought I was helping." "But then you discovered some of the clients weren't legitimate," Raymond said. "Fitzgerald came to me 6 months ago. Said he needed treatment for a business associate who couldn't go to a regular hospital. When I realized what kind of business he was in, I tried to stop, but he threatened to expose everything. My involvement, with Hartley, the false medical records, even Julia's location." Miss Marple studied the young doctor's face in the flickering firelight. "So you've been trapped, just like Mr. Hartley was. Worse than trapped. Fitzgerald has been blackmailing me, demanding that I provide medical cover for his operations, false death certificates, fabricated medical histories, even drugs that could make murder look like natural causes." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place in Miss Marple's mind. "Dr. Morrison, did you provide Fitzgerald with something that could be used to kill Mr. Hartley?" The doctor's silence was answer enough. "I never thought he would actually use it," he whispered finally. "He said he just wanted something to threaten Hartley with, to keep him in line. When I heard Hartley was dead—" "You realized you'd been an accessory to murder," Miss Marple finished gently. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, and in the distance, Miss Marple could hear the sound of approaching vehicles. Inspector Slack's surveillance team had finally moved into action. "Dr. Morrison," she said urgently, "if you help us catch Fitzgerald, if you testify about what he forced you to do, there may still be a chance to make this right." The young doctor looked up at her with desperate hope. "You think so?" "I think," Miss Marple said firmly, "that good people sometimes make terrible mistakes when they're trying to protect the ones they love. The question is what you do next." As the sound of car doors slamming echoed through the fog, Dr. Morrison carefully placed the medical folder on the desk and stood up. "I'll tell them everything," he said quietly. "Everything I know about Fitzgerald, about the blackmail, about what I gave him to use against Hartley. It's time this ended." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important discoveries weren't about who committed the crime, but about who had the courage to help stop it from happening again. Chapter 10. The Blackmail Scheme. The dawn light filtering through Thornfield House's grimy windows revealed the full extent of the conspiracy that had been operating under St. Mary Mead's peaceful facade. Inspector Slack's team had worked through the night, cataloguing evidence, while Dr. Morrison provided a detailed confession that painted a picture of systematic blackmail and corruption. Miss Marple sat in the study where so much had been revealed, watching as forensic specialists carefully preserved the documents that Dr. Morrison had been attempting to destroy. The young doctor himself sat nearby, looking years older than he had just hours before, but with the relief of someone who had finally unburdened himself of a terrible secret. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Inspector Slack said, consulting his notes. "Dr. Morrison, you're saying that Fitzgerald has been blackmailing multiple people involved in Hartley's identity creation service?" Dr. Morrison nodded wearily. "It started about 8 months ago. Fitzgerald somehow discovered that Hartley was keeping detailed records of all his clients, both legitimate and criminal. He realized he could use that information as leverage." Raymond, who had been examining the medical files, looked up with a grim expression. "These records show treatments for at least a dozen people using false identities. Some appear to be legitimate refugees from domestic violence, but others were criminals using new identities to evade prosecution," Dr. Morrison finished. "Fitzgerald threatened to expose everyone unless they continued to provide services or pay monthly fees." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles to study a particular document. "This is quite sophisticated. Mr. Fitzgerald wasn't just stealing art. He was running a protection racket using Mr. Hartley's client list as his weapon." "Exactly," Dr. Morrison said. "Hartley was trapped. If he refused to cooperate, innocent people like Julia would be exposed to their abusers. If he continued, he was facilitating serious crimes." Inspector Slack was taking careful notes. "And you provided medical support for this operation?" "Against my will initially. Fitzgerald needed medical records to make the false identities more convincing. Birth certificates are one thing, but medical histories going back decades, that requires a doctor's cooperation." Miss Marple set down the document she'd been reading. "Dr. Morrison, when did you realize that Mr. Fitzgerald intended to kill Mr. Hartley?" The young doctor's face went pale. 2 weeks before Hartley died, Fitzgerald came to my surgery. He said Hartley was becoming unreliable and asked me about drugs that could cause heart failure without leaving obvious traces. "And you provided them?" Raymond asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I gave him digitalis, told him it was for a patient with a heart condition. I swear I thought he was telling the truth. It wasn't until Hartley's body was found that I realized what I'd done." Miss Marple leaned forward intently. "Dr. Morrison, did Mr. Fitzgerald say anything else about his plans for Mr. Hartley?" "He mentioned that Hartley had become too curious about the Thornfield House operation. Apparently, Hartley had discovered that Fitzgerald was using the house for more than just a mailing address. He was storing stolen artwork there before shipping it overseas." Inspector Slack made another note. "We found evidence of that in the cellar. Packing materials, shipping labels, even some paintings that match items on Interpol's stolen art database." The picture that emerged from Dr. Morrison's confession was one of escalating criminality. What had begun as Thomas Hartley's compassionate effort to help vulnerable people had been corrupted into an international smuggling operation, with Fitzgerald using blackmail to maintain control over an unwilling network of accomplices. "The truly diabolical part," Miss Marple observed, "was how Mr. Fitzgerald used people's better natures against them. Dr. Morrison wanted to help his sister-in-law. Mr. Hartley wanted to protect his legitimate clients, and all of them were trapped by their own compassion. Dr. Morrison looked up at her with grateful eyes. "You understand, then? I never meant to hurt anyone." "Of course, dear, but understanding doesn't excuse the consequences. Mr. Hartley is dead because of the drug you provided." "I know," Dr. Morrison said quietly. "I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life." Raymond had been studying a timeline he'd constructed from the various documents. "There's something else here. Look at these dates. Fitzgerald's blackmail operation began just after the art theft conference, where that photograph was taken. He must have identified potential victims there." "Including Julia Morrison," Miss Marple added. "He knew she was hiding from a violent husband, which made her particularly vulnerable to threats of exposure." Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a snap. "Right. We have enough evidence to arrest Fitzgerald for murder, blackmail, art theft, and conspiracy. Dr. Morrison, you'll need to come with us to make a formal statement." As they prepared to leave Thornfield House, Miss Marple took one last look around the study where Reginald Ashworth had supposedly lived his paper existence. The irony wasn't lost on her. A man who had never existed had become the center of a very real web of crime and corruption. "Inspector," she said as they walked toward the front door, "I assume you have Mr. Fitzgerald under surveillance, round the clock. He's been at his shop since yesterday evening, apparently conducting normal business. We'll move to arrest him within the hour." But Miss Marple felt a familiar unease, the same instinct that had served her well in previous cases. "I wonder if it might be wise to check on Julia Morrison first. If Mr. Fitzgerald realizes his operation has been exposed." Inspector Slack paused, his hand on the door handle. "You think he might try to eliminate witnesses? I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that a man who has killed once and built his operation on blackmail and intimidation might not hesitate to kill again if he feels cornered." They hurried through the morning mist toward Mrs. Bantry's house, but even before they reached the front door, Miss Marple could see that something was wrong. The door stood slightly ajar, and there was no sign of the usual morning activity. "Mrs. Bantry!" Miss Marple called as they approached. The response came from inside the house. Mrs. Bantry's voice, but strained and frightened. "Jane! Thank goodness! Please, be careful! He has a gun!" Miss Marple's blood ran cold. Fitzgerald hadn't waited for them to come to him. He had come for the one person who could connect him directly to Thomas Hartley's murder, and he had arrived first. "Inspector," she whispered urgently, "I believe we're about to discover just how desperate Mr. Fitzgerald has become." The game, as her nephew might say, had taken a decidedly dangerous turn. Chapter 11. The Real Killer. The scene inside Mrs. Bantry's sitting room was one that would remain etched in Miss Marple's memory for years to come. Mrs. Bantry sat rigidly in her favourite armchair, her face pale but determined, while Julia Morrison huddled on the sofa nearby. Standing between them and the door was a man Miss Marple had seen around the village but had never properly met. Not Fitzgerald as she had expected, but someone far more unexpected. "Mr. Pemberton," she said quietly, recognizing the nervous bank manager who had shown them Ashworth's account details just days before. "How surprising to find you here." The bank manager's hand shook as he pointed a small revolver in their direction. Gone was the diffident, anxious man they had met at the bank. In his place stood someone desperate and dangerous, his eyes darting between the windows as if expecting pursuit. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight with strain, "I was hoping you wouldn't become involved in this. You should have left well enough alone." Inspector Slack had positioned himself slightly behind Miss Marple, his hand moving slowly toward his radio. "Mr. Pemberton, I'm Inspector Slack. Why don't you put the gun down and we can discuss this calmly?" Pemberton laughed bitterly. "Discuss it? There's nothing to discuss. My life is over. 20 years of careful planning, and it's all falling apart because of one interfering old woman and a solicitor who got too greedy." Miss Marple stepped carefully into the room, her voice gentle but probing. "You're not talking about Mr. Fitzgerald, are you? You're talking about Mr. Hartley." "Hartley was supposed to be my partner, not my blackmailer," Pemberton spat. "We had a perfect arrangement. He created the identities, I managed the financial side through the bank, clean, profitable, and completely undetectable." Raymond, who had remained near the doorway, spoke quietly. "But something changed." "Hartley developed a conscience," Pemberton said with disgust. "Started questioning the clients we were serving, wanting to know where the money was coming from. When he discovered the art theft operation, he threatened to expose everything." Miss Marple was beginning to understand the true scope of the conspiracy. "So you killed him to protect your operation?" "I had no choice." Pemberton's voice rose dangerously. "Do you have any idea how much money was flowing through those accounts? Millions of pounds from art sales, money laundering, identity services. Hartley was going to destroy it all because of some misguided moral awakening." Mrs. Bantry, showing remarkable composure for someone being held at gunpoint, spoke for the first time. "But surely murder wasn't the only solution." Pemberton turned toward her, his face twisted with frustration. "You don't understand. Hartley had documented everything, every transaction, every client, every illegal activity. He was going to take it all to the police. I would have lost everything, my job, my reputation, my freedom." Miss Marple was slowly piecing together the timeline. "So you arranged to meet him at Thornfield House." "I told him I'd found irregularities in the Ashworth accounts that needed his immediate attention. He came that night, trusting me completely." Pemberton's laugh was hollow. "Even brought his briefcase full of evidence, planning to show me what he'd discovered about our criminal clients." "And you poisoned him," Inspector Slack said grimly. "The digitalis was Doctor." Morrison's idea, though he didn't know it. I'd been complaining about chest pains, and he mentioned how dangerous the drug could be in the wrong doses. It seemed appropriate. Hartley's death would look natural, and I could claim the Ashworth identity had died with him. Julia Morrison, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke up. "But you made a mistake. You placed that obituary in the newspaper." Pemberton's face flushed with anger. "That wasn't my idea. Fitzgerald insisted on it, said it would provide closure and prevent anyone from asking questions about Ashworth's sudden disappearance. I told him it was unnecessary, but he wouldn't listen." Miss Marple felt another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. "Mr. Fitzgerald was your partner in the art theft operation." "Junior partner," Pemberton corrected. "I provided the financial infrastructure. He provided the merchandise and distribution network. It was perfectly balanced until Hartley started interfering." "But Mr. Fitzgerald didn't know you were planning to kill Mr. Hartley," Raymond observed. "Of course not. Fitzgerald's a criminal, but he's not a killer. He would have tried to find another solution, probably involving more blackmail and threats. I couldn't risk it." Inspector Slack had managed to signal his backup team, and Miss Marple could hear the faint sound of vehicles approaching. But Pemberton seemed oblivious, lost in his justification of murder. The irony, he continued, is that Hartley's death should have solved everything. With him gone, I could have gradually wound down the operation, transferred the remaining funds, and retired quietly. But then you started asking questions, Miss Marple. You and your nephew poking around, making connections. We were simply curious about a man who seemed never to have existed, Miss Marple said mildly. Exactly. That's what made it so dangerous. Ashworth was supposed to be invisible, a ghost who left no traces. But your investigation was making him real, connecting him to actual people and places. Mrs. Bantry shifted slightly in her chair. So you decided to eliminate the witnesses? Starting with Mrs. Morrison, Pemberton confirmed, gesturing toward Julia with the gun. She knew too much about Hartley's client list, about the connections between the legitimate and criminal operations. With her gone, the trail would go cold. Miss Marple could hear footsteps on the gravel outside. Inspector Slack's backup team moving into position. But she also noticed that Pemberton was becoming increasingly agitated, his grip on the gun tightening. Mr. Pemberton, she said gently, surely you realize this can't end well. You're surrounded, and more people know the truth now than ever before. Then I have nothing left to lose, he replied, his voice taking on a desperate edge. If I'm going to prison for murder, I might as well make it worthwhile. He raised the gun toward Julia Morrison, but before he could fire, Mrs. Bantry acted with surprising speed for a woman of her age. She threw herself sideways from her chair, knocking into Pemberton's legs and sending him stumbling. The gun went off, the bullet embedding itself harmlessly in the ceiling as Inspector Slack and his team burst through the front door. Within seconds, Pemberton was on the ground, the weapon kicked safely away, his hands cuffed behind his back. Well, Mrs. Bantry said, brushing dust from her skirt as she stood up. That was rather more excitement than I usually have before lunch. Miss Marple helped her friend to a chair, her own hands shaking slightly from the aftermath of adrenaline. My dear Dolly, that was extraordinarily brave of you. Nonsense, Mrs. Bantry replied briskly. I simply couldn't stand listening to that dreadful man justify murder any longer. Some things are simply inexcusable, regardless of the financial incentives. As Pemberton was led away, still protesting his innocence and the unfairness of his situation, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of the case. Thomas Hartley had died trying to protect the innocent people he had helped, killed by the very man he had trusted to safeguard their new identities. Inspector, she said as the immediate chaos subsided, I assume you'll be arresting Mr. Fitzgerald as well? Already in custody, Slack confirmed. We picked him up at his shop an hour ago. Turns out he was planning to flee the country, had a suitcase full of cash, and a false passport ready. The mystery of the man who never lived was finally solved, but Miss Marple couldn't help feeling that the real tragedy lay not in Reginald Ashworth's fictional death, but in the very real death of a man who had spent his life trying to help others find safety and peace. Sometimes, she reflected sadly, the greatest evil came not from those who set out to do harm, but from those who allowed greed to corrupt their better natures. Chapter 12. The Unexpected Accomplice. The arrest of Mr. Pemberton should have brought the case to a satisfying conclusion, but Miss Marple found herself troubled by loose ends that refused to tie themselves neatly together. As she sat in her morning room the following day, reviewing the events of the past week, several inconsistencies nagged at her orderly mind. Raymond, she said, as her nephew joined her for afternoon tea, I've been thinking about Dr. Morrison's confession. Something doesn't quite fit. Raymond settled into his chair, looking considerably more relaxed now that the immediate danger had passed. What sort of thing? The timing primarily. Dr. Morrison said he provided the digitalis 2 weeks before Mr. Hartley's death, but the autopsy results suggest the poison was administered much more recently, perhaps only hours before death. Perhaps Pemberton held on to it for a while before using it. Miss Marple shook her head. Digitalis is most effective when fresh. A banker like Mr. Pemberton would hardly be an expert on pharmaceutical timing. No, I think someone else was involved. Someone with medical knowledge who could advise on the proper dosage and timing. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, who looked unusually grave as Cherry showed him into the sitting room. "Miss Marple, Raymond," he said, declining the offered tea with an absent wave. "I'm afraid I have some rather disturbing news about my young partner." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. "Dr. Morrison. I've been reviewing his patient files since his arrest, trying to understand the scope of his involvement in this identity business. What I've found is troubling." Dr. Haydock pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table between them. "These are medical records for patients I've never seen, treatments I never authorized, prescriptions written in my name, but not in my handwriting." Raymond leaned forward to examine the documents. "You're saying, Doctor?" Morrison was conducting unauthorized medical practice. More than that. He was creating entirely fictional medical histories for people who may not have existed at all. Look at this. Dr. Haydock pointed to a particular file. Treatment records for one R.P. Ashworth going back 5 years. Routine checkups, minor ailments, even a prescription for heart medication. Miss Marple felt a chill of understanding. He was creating a complete medical identity for the fictional Mr. Ashworth. Exactly. But here's what's truly disturbing. Some of these records show treatments that could only have been administered by someone with advanced medical training. Procedures I certainly never taught him. "What sort of procedures?" Raymond asked. Dr. Haydock's face was grim. "Techniques for administering drugs in ways that would be difficult to detect post-mortem. Methods for making murder look like natural death." Miss Marple stood and walked to her window, her mind working rapidly through the implications. "Dr. Haydock, when did Dr. Morrison join your practice?" "About 18 months ago. Came with excellent references from a practice in London. Said he wanted to work in a quiet village setting." "And when did the more sophisticated medical procedures begin appearing in these files?" Dr. Haydock consulted his notes. "The earliest I can find is about 15 months ago, just after he'd settled into the practice." Miss Marple turned back to face them, her expression troubled. "I think we need to have another conversation with Dr. Morrison, and perhaps we should ask Inspector Slack to join us." An hour later, they were seated in the interview room at the local police station, where Dr. Morrison waited with his solicitor. The young doctor looked haggard, his earlier relief at confession replaced by a new anxiety. "Dr. Morrison," Miss Marple began gently, "we've discovered some additional medical records that suggest your involvement in this affair was more extensive than you initially indicated." Dr. Morrison's solicitor started to object, but the doctor himself held up a hand. "No, it's all right. I think it's time for the complete truth." Inspector Slack leaned forward, intently. "You mean there's more?" "Everything I told you before was true, but it wasn't the whole story." Dr. Morrison's voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't just provide medical support for Hartley's clients. I was recruited specifically for this operation." "Recruited by whom?" Raymond asked. "By Pemberton. He approached me while I was still working in London. said he had a business opportunity in a quiet village. Good money, respectable practice, and some additional consulting work that would be very lucrative. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And this consulting work involved creating medical histories for fictional identities. At first, yes. Pemberton explained that they were helping people who needed to disappear for their own safety. It seemed legitimate, even noble. But gradually, the requests became more questionable. Dr. Haydock spoke up, his voice heavy with disappointment. The advanced procedures in these files, where did you learn those techniques? Dr. Morrison's face flushed with shame. From a man Pemberton introduced me to, someone with extensive knowledge of forensic medicine and how to circumvent it. Someone who taught you how to commit undetectable murder, Inspector Slack said bluntly. I never thought of it that way at the time. He presented it as academic knowledge, ways to understand how deaths might be misclassified. But yes, I learned techniques that could be used to kill without leaving obvious traces. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, the full scope of the conspiracy finally becoming clear. Dr. Morrison, when Mr. Pemberton asked you for digitalis, did he specify how it should be administered? He said it was for a patient with a heart condition, but he also asked about dosages that might cause cardiac arrest. I thought he was just being thorough, wanting to understand the risks. But you provided specific instructions on timing and administration. Dr. Morrison nodded miserably. I even gave him syringes and showed him how to inject it in a way that would be difficult to detect. I thought I was helping him treat a patient safely. Inspector Slack was taking careful notes. So you were an active participant in planning Hartley's murder, even if you didn't realize it at the time. I was a fool, Dr. Morrison said, tears beginning to flow. I wanted to believe I was helping people, but I was just another tool in Pemberton's criminal enterprise. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but insistent. Dr. Morrison, this man who taught you the forensic techniques, do you know his real name? He called himself Doctor Stevens, but I don't think that was his real name. He had extensive knowledge of police procedures, seemed to know exactly how post-mortem examinations were conducted. Could he have been a former police surgeon? Raymond suggested. Possibly. Or someone who had worked closely with law enforcement. He knew too much about investigative procedures to be just an academic. As they left the police station, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of Dr. Morrison's situation. Like Thomas Hartley, he had been drawn into the conspiracy by his desire to help people, only to discover too late that his compassion was being exploited for criminal purposes. The truly diabolical aspect of this case, she said to Raymond as they walked home through the village, is how Pemberton used people's better natures against them. He recruited a doctor who wanted to help patients, partnered with a solicitor who wanted to protect vulnerable people, and corrupted them both into accessories to murder. Do you think, Doctor, Morrison will face charges for Hartley's death? Miss Marple considered the question carefully. I think that will depend on whether the authorities believe his ignorance of Pemberton's true intentions was genuine. But regardless of the legal outcome, he'll have to live with the knowledge that his actions contributed to a good man's death. As they reached her cottage gate, Miss Marple paused to look back toward the village centre, where life was slowly returning to its normal, peaceful rhythm. But she knew that beneath the surface, the scars of this case would take a long time to heal. Sometimes, she said quietly, the most dangerous criminals are those who convince good people to do evil things in the name of helping others. Chapter 13. Miss Marple's Trap. 3 days after Pemberton's arrest, Miss Marple sat in her morning room, ostensibly absorbed in her knitting, but actually deep in thought about the one remaining loose thread in the case. The mysterious Dr. Stevens, who had trained Dr. Morrison in forensic deception techniques, had vanished as completely as if he had never existed, rather like the late Reginald Ashworth himself. "Aunt Jane," Raymond said, joining her with the Morning Post, "you have that look again. The one that usually means you're planning something that will give Inspector Slack indigestion." Miss Marple smiled innocently. "I was merely thinking about loose ends, dear. It troubles me that this doctor, Stevens, remains unidentified. A man with his specialized knowledge could be very dangerous if he's still operating. The police are investigating. Surely that's sufficient." "Perhaps, but I can't help feeling that he might still be in the area. After all, his carefully constructed operation has just collapsed. He might want to tidy up any remaining evidence." Miss Marple's instincts proved correct that very afternoon. She was in her garden, ostensibly deadheading the last of the autumn roses, when she noticed a man walking slowly past her cottage. He paused at her gate, studying the house with the careful attention of someone conducting surveillance. He was middle-aged, unremarkable in appearance, but there was something about his posture and the way he observed his surroundings that suggested professional training. When he noticed her watching him, he smiled and approached the gate. "Excuse me," he said in a cultured voice with just a hint of an accent she couldn't quite place. "I'm looking for Thornfield House. I believe I may have taken a wrong turn." "Oh, you're quite close," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, setting down her gardening shears. "Just continue down this road and turn left at Elm Grove. Though I should mention, the house is currently unoccupied." "Ah, that's unfortunate. I was hoping to speak with the owner about some historical research I'm conducting." Miss Marple studied his face carefully. "Historical research? How interesting. What sort of history?" "Local genealogy, primarily. I'm particularly interested in families who may have relocated to the area in recent years." The phrasing was careful, almost coded, and Miss Marple felt certain she was speaking with the elusive doctor. "Stevens, I'm afraid I can't help you there. Though you might try the village library. Miss Harmon is quite knowledgeable about local families." "Thank you for the suggestion." He tipped his hat politely. "You've been most helpful, Miss Marple, Jane Marple." For just a moment, his pleasant expression flickered, and Miss Marple saw something cold and calculating in his eyes. "Miss Marple." "Yes, I believe I've heard your name mentioned recently. You've been quite active in local affairs." "Village life does tend to involve everyone in everyone else's business," she replied mildly. "It's one of the charms of St. Mary Mead." After he left, Miss Marple immediately telephoned Inspector Slack. "Inspector, I believe our missing Dr. Stevens has just paid me a visit. He's currently walking toward the village centre." "Are you certain it was him?" "As certain as I can be without a formal identification. He was asking about Thornfield House and seemed very interested when I mentioned my name." "We'll pick him up for questioning. Miss Marple, please stay inside until we've apprehended him." But Miss Marple had no intention of remaining safely at home. If Dr. Stevens was indeed in the village, he was here for a reason, most likely to retrieve or destroy evidence that could connect him to the conspiracy, and she had a strong suspicion about where he might go. An hour later, as dusk was settling over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple made her way carefully toward Thornfield House. The police had finished their investigation of the property, but she suspected that Dr. Stevens might know of hiding places they had missed. She positioned herself in the same copse of trees where she and Raymond had maintained their vigil just days before. The house stood dark and silent, its windows reflecting the last light of the autumn evening. She didn't have long to wait. Just as full darkness fell, she saw a figure approaching the house from the rear garden. Moving with practiced stealth, the man she had met at her gate made his way to what appeared to be a cellar entrance hidden beneath overgrown ivy. Miss Marple waited until he had disappeared inside, then carefully made her way closer to the house. Through a small cellar window, she could see the beam of a flashlight moving systematically through the underground space. She had brought her mobile phone, and now she used it to call Inspector Slack. "He's here," she whispered, "in the cellar of Thornfield House. I think he's retrieving something the police missed. We're on our way. Stay back, Miss Marple. Don't try to apprehend him yourself." But even as she spoke, Miss Marple heard footsteps on the cellar stairs. Dr. Stevens was emerging, carrying what appeared to be a small suitcase. She pressed herself against the side of the house, hoping the shadows would conceal her. "Good evening again, Miss Marple," came a voice from directly behind her. She turned to find Dr. Stevens standing just a few feet away, no longer bothering to maintain his pleasant facade. In his hand was a small but efficient-looking pistol. "Dr. Stevens, I presume," she said calmly. "Or should I say, the man who taught Dr. Morrison how to commit undetectable murder. Very good. Though Stevens isn't my real name, of course. I've had so many identities over the years that I sometimes forget which one I'm using. And what's in the suitcase? Evidence of your other operations." He smiled coldly. "Insurance policies. Documentation of every criminal I've ever helped, every corrupt official I've worked with, every murder I've facilitated. It's amazing how useful such information can be." Miss Marple could hear the distant sound of approaching vehicles. Inspector Slack's team responding to her call, but they were still several minutes away. "You've been running a blackmail operation of your own," she observed. "Among other things, Pemberton was useful, but hardly irreplaceable. There are always ambitious people willing to compromise their principles for the right price. And when they become inconvenient, you eliminate them. When necessary. Poor Hartley, for instance. He was becoming far too curious about the medical aspects of our operation. It was only a matter of time before he connected me to some of his clients' untimely deaths." Miss Marple felt a chill of understanding. "You've done this before, created networks of unwitting accomplices, then disposed of them when they became liabilities. It's a very effective business model, though I must admit, your interference has been unexpected. I hadn't planned on dealing with an amateur detective." The sound of car engines was growing closer, and Dr. Stevens glanced nervously toward the road. "I'm afraid our conversation must be brief, Miss Marple. You've caused me considerable inconvenience, and I can't allow you to continue interfering with my work." He raised the pistol, but before he could fire, a voice called out from the darkness, "Armed police! Drop your weapon!" Inspector Slack and his team had arrived with remarkable stealth, surrounding the house while Dr. Stevens was distracted by his conversation with Miss Marple. Within moments he was disarmed and in custody, his suitcase of incriminating evidence secured. "Miss Marple," Inspector Slack said as the prisoner was led away, "I thought I told you to stay back." "Yes, dear, but someone needed to keep him talking until you arrived, and I must say, he was quite informative about his methods." As they walked back toward the village, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of deception they had unravelled. What had begun as a simple obituary for a man who never existed had revealed an international criminal network built on the corruption of good intentions. "The truly tragic aspect," she said to Raymond, who had arrived with the police team, "is how many genuinely good people were drawn into this conspiracy. Dr. Morrison, Mr. Hartley, even some of the clients who thought they were simply seeking help. But justice has been served," Raymond pointed out. "Pemberton and Dr. Stevens will face trial for murder, and the art theft network has been dismantled." Yes, but at such a cost. Thomas Hartley died trying to protect the innocent people he had helped, and Dr. Morrison's career is ruined despite his good intentions. As they reached her cottage gate, Miss Marple paused to look back at Thornfield House, now truly empty for the first time in years. The fictional Reginald Ashworth was finally, genuinely dead, taking with him the secrets and lies that had cost so many people so much. "I think," she said quietly, "that this case will remind me always that the greatest evil often comes disguised as the greatest good, and that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are those who convince others to commit crimes in the name of helping people." The mystery of the man who never lived was solved, but its lessons would linger long in the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, a reminder that even in the quietest places, human nature remained as complex and dangerous as ever. In her final report to Inspector Slack, Miss Marple noted that the case had revealed not just a criminal conspiracy, but a fundamental truth about the human condition. That our greatest strengths, compassion, trust, the desire to help others, could also become our greatest vulnerabilities when exploited by those without conscience. The obituary that had started it all was finally truly accurate. Reginald Ashworth was dead, and with him died one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises St. Mary Mead had ever unknowingly harboured.